Adam Schiff stood before the mirror, but he wasn't looking at himself. He was looking at the character he had perfected over half a decade. He adjusted his tie, crimson, the color of alarm, the color of urgent national security. He smoothed the lapel of his jacket. It wasn't just a suit, it was armor. For 5 years, this man had held the Capitol captive with nothing more than a furrowed brow and a somber tone. He practiced the expression now. He lowered his chin slightly, widened his eyes just enough to convey burden, the look of a man carrying the weight of secrets too terrible to share. Perfect. Gravity, he whispered to the reflection. Always gravity. In his mind, the script was already written. It always was. Today was supposed to be a cleanup operation. Tulsi Gabbard. The name tasted like ash in his mouth. She was a glitch in the matrix. A Democrat who didn't follow the memo. A woman who had served in uniform but refused to bow to the intelligence complex he now treated as his personal fiefdom. She had been asking too many questions about the surveillance state, about the dossier, about the origins of the narratives he had painstakingly built. She had to be neutralized, not with facts. Facts were messy, facts could be checked, but with the fog. Schiff checked his watch. The legacy media was already in position. CNN, MSNBC, the print reporters who transcribed his leaks as gospel. They were his Praetorian Guard. All he had to do was say the magic words. Russia, asset, compromised. The headlines would write themselves by noon. The social media mobs would descend by 1. By dinner, Tulsi Gabbard would be radioactive. He washed his hands. The water was hot, scalding. He liked the heat. It felt like power. He dried his hands with a paper towel, crumpling it into a tight, perfect ball before tossing it into the trash. That's what today was. A disposal. He wasn't afraid of her. Why would he be? He was the chairman. He was the face of the resistance. He had survived the collapse of the Mueller report. He had survived the impeachment acquittal. He was Teflon. He opened the door and stepped into the hallway. The marble floors echoed with the sound of his footsteps, a rhythm of absolute, unearned confidence. He didn't know it yet, but he was walking toward the guillotine. The room was freezing. It was a deliberate choice. Keep the temperature low, keep the witnesses uncomfortable, keep the adrenaline spiking. The hearing room wasn't designed for finding truth. It was designed for television. The lighting rigs were positioned to cast shadows on the witness table while bathing the dais, where the committee members sat in a halo of authority. The air smelled of stale coffee, carpet cleaner, and fear. Staffers scurried like worker ants, placing binders thick with research in front of the empty seats. These weren't intelligence reports. They were opposition research files disguised as government documents. The room buzzed with the low murmur of the press pool. They were hungry. They knew Schiff was going to deliver a kill shot today. Schiff entered. The room shifted. The murmurs died down, replaced by the frantic clicking of camera shutters. Click, 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 click. The sound was intoxicating. It was the applause of the swamp. He nodded solely to the friendly faces in the press gallery, the ones who took his off-the-record calls late at night. He ignored the few independent journalists in the back. They didn't matter. They didn't have the reach. He took his seat at the center of the dais, the high ground. From here, he looked down on everyone, literally. And then she walked in. Tulsi Gabbard didn't have an entourage. She didn't have a team of nervous aides whispering talking points into her ear. She walked in alone. She wore a blazer that was sharp, utilitarian. Her hair was pulled back. Her face was unreadable. Schiff watched her from his perch. He looked for the tell. He looked for the nervous fidgeting, the darting eyes, the shallow breathing that every witness displayed before he dissected them. He saw nothing. She moved with a stillness that was unnerving. It wasn't the stillness of paralysis. It was the stillness of a predator waiting in the tall grass. She pulled out her chair and sat. She placed a single folder on the table. No water bottle, no phone, just the folder and a pen. She looked up. Her eyes locked onto his. For a fraction of a second, the temperature in the room seemed to drop another 10 degrees. Schiff felt a prickle on the back of his neck, a primal warning system that he had ignored for too long. But he brushed it aside. She was just posturing. She was a soldier, yes, but this was his battlefield. In this room, bullets didn't matter. Narratives did. He tapped the gavel. The sound cracked through the room like a pistol shot. "The committee will come to order," Schiff intoned. His voice was smooth, practiced, dripping with that faux paternal concern that drove half the country mad. "We are here to discuss the integrity of our intelligence community and the threats, the insidious threats, that seek to undermine it from within." He paused for effect. The cameras zoomed in. Director Gabbard. He began, not looking at her, but looking past her, addressing the lens. "We are living in dangerous times. Our adversaries are active. They are sophisticated, and they're looking for voices here in Washington that they can amplify." It was a masterclass in innuendo. He hadn't accused her of anything technically. He had just painted a picture and placed her inside the frame. Gabbard sat motionless. She didn't reach for her microphone. She just watched him. It was the look of someone watching a man dig his own grave and deciding not to hand him a ladder. Director Gabbard, Schiff continued, shuffling papers he had no intention of reading. "You've publicly questioned intelligence assessments that were shared by bipartisan leadership. Assessments our allies relied on. Assessments our adversaries openly celebrated when they were undermined." He looked down at her over the rim of his glasses. This was the trap, the standard Washington trap. If she denied it, she looked defensive. If she argued the details, she got bogged down in the weeds where he could drown her in jargon. But she did neither. Gabbard leaned in. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't accuse. She didn't follow his script. "Concerns about what, Senator?" she asked. Her voice was quiet, steady. It cut through the hum of the air conditioner. Schiff blinked. He hadn't expected a question. Witnesses don't ask questions. Witnesses answer them. He felt a flicker of annoyance. He needed to correct the power dynamic immediately. "About judgment," Schiff said, sharpening his tone. "About susceptibility. About whether skepticism crosses into something more dangerous." "So, let's be precise," Gabbard said. She leaned forward, her elbows on the table. The movement was deliberate. She was closing the distance. "Are you suggesting that I am compromised by a foreign power?" The room stiffened. The aides in the back row stopped typing on their BlackBerries. The reporters looked up from their notepads. This wasn't the polite dance they were used to. This was a direct confrontation. Schiff hated directness. Directness left no room for the maneuverability he relied on. He smiled faintly, a condescending, thin-lipped expression. "I'm saying your positions have been useful to them." "That's not what I asked," Gabbard replied instantly. The speed of her response was lethal. "Are you alleging foreign compromise?" Schiff exhaled audibly, a sound of theatrical patience. "I'm saying there are patterns that warrant scrutiny." "Then state the conclusion those patterns lead you to," she pressed. "Say it clearly." Schiff shifted in his chair. The leather creaked, a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the sudden silence. He realized, with a dawning horror, that she wasn't trying to defend herself. She was trying to pin him down. She was hunting him. "This committee has seen intelligence," Schiff said, retreating to his safe space. "The classified bunker." "Which intelligence?" Gabbard interrupted. "Much of it is classified," Schiff snapped. He felt safer now. The word classified was his shield. It was the magic spell that usually made questions disappear. "I'm the director of national intelligence," Gabbard said. The words hung in the air. Schiff froze. For a moment, he had forgotten who she was. He was so used to interrogating civilians, frightened aides, or political hacks that he had forgotten he was talking to the woman who now held the keys to the very library he claimed to be quoting. "I see the same material you do," she continued, her voice relentless. "So, if there's intelligence suggesting I'm compromised, I've read it. If it exists, cite it." Schiff's mind raced. He tapped his pen against the dais. Tap, tap, tap. He needed an exit ramp. He needed to pivot back to concern and away from evidence. Because he knew, deep down in the dark pit where he kept his actual secrets, that there was no file. There was no intelligence. There was only the echo chamber he had built. "You know we can't discuss sensitive sources in an open hearing," Schiff said, his voice dropping an octave, trying to regain the gravity he was losing. "I'm not asking you to expose sources," Gabbard said. "I'm asking whether the evidence exists at all." Silence. Absolute silence. It wasn't the respectful silence of a hearing room listening to a leader. It was the terrified silence of a theater audience watching an acrobat slip from the high wire. Schiff leaned back. The shield was cracking. He could feel the eyes of the press on him. Not the friendly eyes anymore. Curious eyes. Predatory eyes. They smelled blood in the water, and for the first time in 5 years, it wasn't the witness's blood. Director Gabbard, Schiff said, trying to sound dismissive, "This isn't about semantics." "It is exactly about semantics," she replied. And then she delivered the first blow that would start the demolition. "You're implying disloyalty without evidence. That's not oversight. That's innuendo." Schiff felt a flush of heat rise up his neck. Innuendo. The word stung because it was true. But Adam Schiff didn't deal in truth. He dealt in narrative dominance. He needed to get the upper hand back. He needed to make her look unstable, defensive, pro-Russian. He needed to go on the attack. He leaned into the mic, his eyes narrowing. "Are you denying that your statements have a line with Russian narratives?" He thought he had her. It was the classic "when did you stop beating your wife?" question. But Gabbard didn't flinch. She looked at him with a pity that was more insulting than anger. "I'm denying that alignment equals allegiance," she said. "And I'm denying that you have any intelligence proving otherwise." She let the words sit there. A challenge. A gauntlet thrown down on the mahogany table. Schiff's mouth opened slightly, then closed. His brain, usually a supercomputer of spin, hit a syntax error. He had expected her to stutter. He had expected her to explain why she said what she said. He didn't expect her to demand the one thing he didn't have. Proof. Inside his chest, his heart hammered against his ribs. The confident script in his head was dissolving. The room felt smaller. The walls, lined with portraits of past chairmen, seemed to be leaning in, judging him. He looked at his notes. They were useless. Bullet points about concern and implication. Nothing concrete. He looked up at her. She was still waiting. "This is going wrong," his inner monologue screamed. "This is going very wrong." But Adam Schiff was a survivor. He tightened his jaw. He would not be bullied in his own committee room. He would pivot. He would bring up the past. He would bring up the patterns. If he couldn't drown her with facts, he would drown her with history, his version of history. There were moments during previous investigations. He began, his voice gaining strength. "Let's stop dancing," Gabbard cut in. The interruption was physical. It was a slap. "Do you have evidence that I'm compromised?" Schiff hesitated. Just a beat. But in the high-definition era, a beat is an eternity. A beat is a confession. The cameras caught it all. The slight wideness of the eyes, the way his tongue darted out to wet his dry lips, the way his hand froze over his papers. "No," he said finally. The word was quiet, strangled. "Not direct evidence." Gabbard nodded slowly. It was the nod of a coroner confirming the time of death. "Then I'd appreciate it if you stopped suggesting there is." The air in the room didn't just feel heavy. It felt pressurized. The illusion of Adam Schiff, the all-knowing, all-seeing guardian of the Republic, had just taken its first visible crack. And through that crack, the cold light of reality was starting to pour in. But the nightmare for Schiff was only beginning. He thought he had survived the worst. He thought the skirmish was over. He was wrong. She wasn't done with him. She hadn't even started on the oath yet. Schiff cleared his throat. The sound was dry, like sandpaper on stone. No direct evidence. The phrase hung in the room like smoke from a failed engine. He had said it. It was on the record. He could feel the vibration of the aides behind him shifting in their seats. They were already texting damage control teams. Get the spin ready. Contextualize. Pivot. Schiff knew he had to move the goalposts. Immediately. If he stayed on the ground of evidence, he would die there. He had to move to the ground of responsibility. That was his sanctuary. He could justify anything under the banner of protecting the realm. This committee has a responsibility to ask hard questions, Schiff said, his voice regaining some of its practiced resonance. He sat up straighter, trying to physically inflate his diminished stature. "And I have a responsibility to protect the integrity of intelligence." He looked at the cameras, offering them the profile shot he knew they loved. The concerned statesman. "And I have a responsibility to stop it from being weaponized," Gabbard replied. Schiff's head snapped back. She wasn't letting him monologue. She leaned back in her chair, a movement of total relaxation that contrasted sharply with Schiff's rigid posture. For years, she added, her voice dropping to a register that forced everyone to lean in, you've asked the public to trust your implications. She paused, a calculated, devastating pause. Today, I'm asking you to stand by them under oath. Schiff didn't answer immediately. For the first time that morning, the power dynamic in the room had fundamentally shifted, not loudly, not dramatically with a gavel bang, but permanently. It was like watching a ship list 5 degrees to the port side. It hasn't sunk yet, but the captain knows the hull is breached. Schiff straightened his papers. A nervous tick. He was organizing chaos. Director Gabbard, he said, his tone dripping with condescension, let's not pretend this committee hasn't dealt with credibility issues before. It was a veiled insult. He was trying to bait her. Come on, his eyes said. Get angry. Make a scene. Give me a clip I can use on Rachel Maddow tonight. Gabbard didn't bite. She tilted her head, studying him like a biological specimen. Then let's talk about them. Schiff's eyes narrowed. Careful, his instinct warned. But his ego was louder. For years, Schiff said, his tone sharpening, you questioned the findings of intelligence agencies regarding Russian interference. You cast doubt on the consensus. I questioned claims that weren't supported by evidence, Gabbard corrected. I repeatedly stated there was evidence. Schiff shot back. He was leaning forward now, invading the space of the microphone. The fighter mask was slipping on. You stated you had it, Gabbard replied. That's different, Schiff scoffed, waving a hand dismissively. It is, she agreed. Schiff bristled. I said there was more than circumstantial evidence. You said you had direct evidence, Gabbard said. Her voice was flat, factual, a beat. Schiff shook his head, a gesture of mock pity. I said the evidence was compelling. You said it existed, she replied. And you said you'd seen it. She reached for the folder on the table. Schiff's heart stopped. He knew that folder. Every politician in D.C. feared the folder. It meant receipts. It meant quotes. It meant that the vague, foggy memory of cable news appearances was about to be confronted with the hard text of the transcript. Scene 5. The Ghost of Russia Time, 9:18 a.m. Let's walk through this, Gabbard said. She opened the folder. The sound of the paper turning was the only noise in the room. On national television, she began, reading from a document, you told the public you had evidence of a criminal conspiracy between the Trump campaign and Russia. Schiff interjected immediately, based on the intelligence available at the time. And after a 2-year investigation, Gabbard continued, ignoring his interruption. The special counsel found no such conspiracy. Schiff stiffened. The Mueller report. The disappointment that had nearly broken his party. He hated talking about it. He had spent years promising a smoking gun, and Mueller had delivered a water pistol. The report documented extensive contacts, Schiff argued, his voice rising. He was fighting for his life now. It showed a willingness to accept help. It documented no conspiracy, she said. Those are not the same thing. The public deserved to know what we were seeing. Schiff shouted. His composure cracked. The veins in his neck stood out against his starched collar. They deserve the truth, Gabbard replied. Her voice didn't rise. It stayed grounded, anchoring the room. And you told them you had evidence you did not. Schiff exhaled sharply, a hiss of escaping steam. You're oversimplifying a complex investigation. I'm quoting your words, Gabbard said. She looked up from the paper. Would you like me to read them? Silence. Schiff looked away. He looked at the ceiling, the flag, the clock, anywhere but her eyes. He remembered the interviews, the green rooms, the makeup artist dusting his face while he rehearsed the lines. Hidden in plain sight, more than circumstantial. He had felt like a hero then. Now, those words felt like a noose. You fundraised off those claims, she said. It wasn't an accusation. It was an observation of a transactional reality. You went on cable news and said the evidence was hidden in plain sight. Much of it was classified. Schiff insisted. The old reliable shield. Gabbard leaned in. She was enjoying this now. Not with joy, but with the grim satisfaction of a mechanic fixing a broken engine. And yet, she said, when the classification barrier was removed, nothing was there. Schiff tapped the table. Tap, tap, tap. Faster this time. This is revisionist. This is documented, she replied. And I have access to all of it. That was the terrifying variable. She wasn't an outsider anymore. She was inside the vault. She could see the empty shelves where he had claimed the files were kept. Schiff tried to regain control. He adjusted his glasses. He needed to sound authoritative. You're attacking oversight. I'm defending accountability, Gabbard said. Oversight requires accuracy. She paused. Senator, she added, the title sounding almost ironic in her mouth. How many times did you say I've seen the evidence? Schiff didn't answer. He couldn't. The number was in the dozens. Hundreds, maybe. How many times did you let the public believe you had proof that never existed? The room was silent now. The silence of a church. The silence of a funeral. Schiff finally spoke. His voice was lower, stripped of its bluster. I believe the intelligence pointed in that direction. You believe, Gabbard said, and you stated it as fact. She let that sink in. That difference, she continued, is the difference between analysis and propaganda. Schiff's jaw tightened so hard he thought a molar might crack. Propaganda. The word hung over him. He wanted to scream. He wanted to call her a Putin puppet. He wanted to call her a traitor. But he couldn't. Not here. Not with the cameras rolling and her holding the receipts. He felt naked. For years, he had worn the cloak of the Intelligence Committee. It made him mysterious, important. Now, she was stripping it off, revealing him to be nothing more than a partisan operator with a security clearance. Gabbard leaned back. You weren't mistaken once. You repeated it for years. She looked directly at him. And today, under oath, you've admitted you never had direct evidence. Schiff said nothing. And with that silence, a narrative that had lasted half a decade began to collapse. Not with a headline, not with a leak, but with a record. Schiff leaned forward again. He had to try one last gambit. Moral superiority. You're framing this as dishonesty, he said, his voice trembling with manufactured hurt. I'm framing it as a pattern. Gabbard met his eyes. You're ignoring the reality of intelligence work. Schiff cried out. It's about connecting dots. It's about seeing the picture before it's fully formed. Then explain it, Gabbard said. Explain how repeated public certainty becomes acceptable when it's wrong. Schiff lifted a finger. The teacher pose. Much of what informed my statements was classified. Gabbard nodded. And yet the conclusions weren't. She paused. You told the public you had evidence. Not suspicions. Not indicators. Evidence. Evidence can be circumstantial. Schiff responded quickly. You didn't say circumstantial, she replied. You said direct. Schiff's voice hardened. Director Gabbard. Intelligence evolves. So does accountability, she said. And when intelligence evolves, statements should be corrected. Schiff glanced toward the other senators. Senator Warner was looking at his shoes. Senator Rubio was scribbling notes, hiding a smirk. Schiff was alone. This is highly unusual, Schiff muttered. So is this, Gabbard said evenly. A sitting senator implying foreign compromise without proof. Schiff scoffed. A weak, hollow sound. No one was accused under oath. Gabbard leaned in. The room stilled again. The air pressure dropped. Schiff hesitated. His eyes darted. Did I say it under oath? Did I? He replayed the last 10 minutes in his head. He hadn't sworn to it, had he? But the implication was there. The hearing was official. You're reading intent where there was concern, Schiff mumbled. Concern has standards, she said. And those standards exist, so intelligence isn't used as a shield. Schiff folded his arms. A defensive posture. A barrier between him and the truth. You're attacking my credibility. I'm examining it, Gabbard replied. The same way you examine others. She continued, relentless. When someone says I've seen the evidence, the public assumes it exists. The public also understands limitations. Schiff interrupted. They understand certainty, she said. And you gave it to them. Schiff exhaled. A long, defeated breath. You're asking me to disclose classified deliberations. No, Gabbard said. I'm asking you to acknowledge the difference between what you believed and what you proved. Schiff looked at her. He hated her. He hated her calmness. He hated her logic. He hated that she wasn't playing the game. She wasn't trying to win a news cycle. She was trying to dismantle his legacy. And she was succeeding. The house of cards he had built, the Russia collusion narrative, the Steele dossier legitimacy, the aura of infallible intelligence was trembling. He needed a miracle to stop it from falling. But Tulsi Gabbard wasn't in the business of miracles. She was in the business of autopsies. And she was just reaching for the scalpel for the next cut. The room felt tighter now, smaller. It was as if the oxygen was being siphoned out through the vents, leaving only the heavy, recycled air of desperation. Adam Schiff adjusted his collar. It felt tight against his throat, a constricting ring of starch cotton. He looked down at his notes, bullet points, talking points, phrases that had worked 1,000 times on Meet the Press. National security. Protecting sources. Grave concern. They looked like gibberish now. Across the table, Tulsi Gabbard sat in absolute stillness. She wasn't looking at her notes. She was looking at him. Her gaze was physical, a weight pressing against his chest. It wasn't hatred in her eyes. It was something far worse for a man like Schiff. It was clarity. She saw him, not the chairman, not the face of the resistance. She saw the panic behind the glasses. Director Gabbard, Schiff said, breaking the silence first. He needed to hear his own voice. He needed to reassert dominance over the sonic space of the room. Let's move to something concrete. Gabbard nodded. Good. Schiff's voice regained some edge. He thought he saw an opening. A way to shift the battlefield from the quicksand of Russia to the seemingly solid ground of process. The FISA process. Gabbard's eyes sharpened slightly. Let's. Schiff leaned forward. He felt more comfortable here. This was bureaucratic terrain. You're suggesting misconduct where there was none. You're reading malice into procedural errors. I'm suggesting documented errors, Gabbard replied calmly. Fatal errors. Schiff waved a hand, a dismissive gesture he had perfected over decades in committee rooms. I released a memo showing there was no abuse. The Democratic response memo. You released a memo dismissing concerns, Gabbard corrected, her voice cutting through his deflection like a laser. And later, the Inspector General confirmed multiple errors and omissions. Your memo was wrong. Schiff frowned. Errors are not abuse. 17 significant inaccuracies, she replied. She didn't look down at the file. She knew the number. Every person in the room knew the number. In surveillance applications targeting a U.S. citizen. You called it a conspiracy theory. The Inspector General called it reality. Schiff stiffened. The memory of that memo burned. He had staked his reputation on it. He had gone on every network, looked into every camera, and guaranteed the American people that the FISA process was pristine. The intent matters, Schiff argued, his voice rising, cracking slightly. We were protecting the country. So does outcome, Gabbard said. And the outcome was unlawful surveillance approved on faulty information. Schiff slammed his hand on the table. A dull thud. My memo reflected the intelligence at the time. And the Inspector General reflected the facts, she answered instantly. Facts you dismissed because they didn't fit your narrative. Schiff shook his head. You're conflating hindsight with misconduct. No, Gabbard said. I'm contrasting your certainty with the record. She leaned in, the predator closing the gap. You told the public claims of abuse were baseless. Schiff interrupted. They were exaggerated. They were validated, she replied, her voice dropping to a hush that silenced the whispering aides behind her. After you assured the country they weren't. Schiff leaned back, crossing his arms over his chest, a classic shield. The process was still lawful. It wasn't accurate, Gabbard said. And accuracy is the foundation of lawful surveillance. Without accuracy, it is just spying. Schiff paused. He looked at the press gallery. They weren't writing down his quotes anymore. They were watching him sweat. He realized, with a sudden, sickening jolt, that he couldn't win on the facts. The Inspector General report was a stone wall he couldn't talk his way through. He had to pivot to morality. You're ignoring context, Schiff said, his voice dripping with righteous indignation. We were under attack. Democracy was under attack. I'm focused on responsibility, she said. You vouched for a process that failed. You signed your name to the denial. Schiff glanced toward the chair, checking the time. How long has it been? 20 minutes? It feels like 20 years. This is becoming political, he muttered. It became political when intelligence was used to dismiss legitimate oversight, Gabbard replied. Schiff pressed his lips together until they were white. You're implying intent again. I'm describing defense, she said. You defended institutions instead of correcting them. You chose the bureaucracy over the truth. Schiff responded sharply. We had to protect confidence. If the public loses faith in the FBI, we lose our ability to investigate. At the cost of truth, Gabbard asked. Silence. She went on, relentless. You attacked those who raised concerns. You called them conspiracy theorists. You called them assets of Putin. Schiff replied quietly, because misinformation spreads. So does institutional denial, she said. And both erode trust. But only one of them was funded by taxpayers. Schiff looked away. He couldn't hold her gaze. The weight of his own hypocrisy was crushing him. The errors were regrettable, he conceded, a rare admission. They were preventable, Gabbard replied, and they were ignored when it mattered most. She leaned back, voice steady. This wasn't a mistake you corrected. It was a failure you defended. And you defended it because the surveillance target was a political opponent. Schiff didn't respond. For years, the memo had been his shield. Now it was an exhibit in his prosecution. The room felt suspended in amber. The air conditioning hummed, a low drone that sounded like a flatline. Schiff needed to end this. He needed to wrap it up, issue a statement, and get to the safety of a friendly green room where the questions were screened. But Gabbard wasn't letting him go. She was steering the ship toward the rocks, and he was handcuffed to the wheel. Director Gabbard, he said, trying to summon the authority of his office. You've made your point. Not yet, she said. Schiff froze. For years, she continued, you've asked the public to trust your implications. You've asked them to read between the lines. You've asked them to believe that you know things they can't know. She placed her hands flat on the table. Today, I'm asking you to stand by them under oath. Schiff didn't answer. The words under oath bounced around the inside of his skull like shrapnel. Under oath. That was the line. That was the electric fence. In the hallway, in front of CNN cameras, he could say anything. He could say he had evidence of aliens if he wanted to. It was legislative speech. It was protected. It was politics. But here, in a hearing, under oath, if he lied here, it wasn't spin. It was perjury. It was a felony. It was prison. Schiff straightened his papers again. A frantic, meaningless motion. Director Gabbard, let's not pretend this committee hasn't dealt with credibility issues before, he said, trying to deflect. Then let's talk about them, she said. Let's talk about yours. Schiff's tone sharpened. I have served this country for 30 years. Then serve it now with the truth, Gabbard replied. She leaned forward. The moment had arrived. You stated on The View, on CNN, on MSNBC, that you'd seen direct evidence of collusion. Not circumstantial. Direct. Schiff opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Do you stand by that statement today? She asked. Right here, under oath. Do you have that evidence? Schiff hesitated. Time didn't just slow down, it stopped. In that single second of hesitation, the entire career of Adam Schiff was laid bare. His mind raced through the options. Option A, say yes. If he said yes, she would demand to see it. Right now. And he didn't have it. He never had it. He would be trapped in a lie so big it would trigger a special counsel investigation into him. He would be the next Roger Stone, the next Michael Flynn. He saw himself in an orange jumpsuit. He saw the mugshot. Impossible. Option B, say no. If he said no, he was admitting that for 5 years, he had lied to the American people. He was admitting that the impeachment, the investigations, the hysteria, it was all built on a bluff. He would be humiliated. The Republicans would use the clip in every campaign ad for the next decade. Political suicide. Option C, the fog. Dance. Waffle. Obfuscate. Use words like impression, cumulative, assessment. He chose option C. He always chose option C. No, he said finally. The word was quiet. Almost a whisper. Not direct evidence. The room exhaled. It was a collective gasp of disbelief. Gabbard nodded slowly. She didn't smile. A smile will be too small for this moment. This was gravity. Then I'd appreciate it if you stopped suggesting there is. Schiff cleared his throat. desperate to fill the void. This committee has a responsibility to ask hard questions, and I have a responsibility to protect the integrity of intelligence, Gabbard replied, which includes stopping it from being weaponized. She leaned back. For years, she added, you've asked the public to trust your implications. Schiff didn't answer. For the first time that morning, the power in the room had shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, but permanently. You said you had it, Gabbard repeated. You looked into the camera and said it. I said the evidence was compelling. Schiff cried out, his voice cracking. You said existed, she replied, and you said you'd seen it. Schiff looked at his hands. They were pale. He felt sick. He realized that the silence following his admission was louder than any accusation she could have made. The silence was the sound of his credibility dying. The air felt heavier now. The house of cards wasn't just shaking. The foundation had liquefied. Schiff cleared his throat again. He needed to pivot. He needed to get away from the evidence question. It was a black hole sucking him in. This is revisionist history, he stammered. It is documented history, she replied, and I have access to all of it. Schiff tried to regain control. You're attacking oversight. I'm defending accountability. Oversight requires accuracy, Gabbard said. She paused. Senator, how many times did you say I've seen the evidence? Schiff didn't answer. How many times did you let the public believe you had proof that never existed? The room was silent now. Schiff finally spoke. I believe the intelligence pointed in that direction. You believe, Gabbard said, and you stated it as fact. Another pause. That difference, she continued, is the difference between analysis and propaganda. Schiff's jaw tightened. Gabbard leaned back. You were mistaken once. You repeated it for years. She looked directly at him. And today, under oath, you've admitted you never had direct evidence. Schiff said nothing. And with that silence, a narrative that had lasted half a decade began to collapse. Not with a headline, not with a leak, but with a record. Schiff leaned forward again. You're framing this as dishonesty. I'm framing it as a pattern. Gabbard met his eyes. You're ignoring the reality of intelligence work. Schiff shook his head. It is about nuance. Then explain it, Gabbard said. Explain how repeated public certainty becomes acceptable when it's wrong. Schiff lifted a finger. Much of what informed my statements was classified. Gabbard nodded. And yet the conclusions weren't. She paused. You told the public you had evidence, not suspicions, not indicators. Evidence. Schiff responded quickly. Evidence can be circumstantial. You didn't say circumstantial, she replied. You said direct. Schiff's voice hardened. Director Gabbard. Intelligence evolves. So does accountability, she said. And when intelligence evolves, statements should be corrected. Schiff glanced toward the other senators. This is highly unusual. So is this, Gabbard said evenly. A sitting senator implying foreign compromise without proof. Schiff scoffed. No one was accused under oath. Gabbard leaned in. I was. The room stilled again. Schiff hesitated. You're reading intent where there was concern. Concern has standards, she said. And those standards exist, so intelligence isn't used as a shield. Schiff folded his arms. You're attacking my credibility. I'm examining it, Gabbard replied. The same way you examine others. She continued. When someone says, I've seen the evidence, the public assumes it exists. Schiff interrupted. The public also understands limitations. They understand certainty, she said. And you gave it to them. Schiff exhaled it. You're asking me to disclose classified deliberations. No, Gabbard said. I'm asking you to acknowledge the difference between what you believed and what you proved. Schiff's tone sharpened. This is a distraction. From what? She asked. The record. A brief silence. Schiff spoke more carefully now. There were legitimate concerns within the intelligence community. Then why weren't they sustained? Gabbard asked. Why did every investigation conclude the same way? Schiff didn't respond immediately. You defended those claims long after they collapsed, she continued. And when they did, there was no correction, no apology. Schiff looked down. The threat was real. The claim wasn't, Gabbard replied. And you blurred the two. She sat back. That blur is why public trust is eroding. Schiff shook his head slowly. This is an unfair characterization. Then clarify it, she said, under oath. Another pause. Schiff avoided her gaze. I acted in good faith. Good faith doesn't excuse false certainty, Gabbard said. And classified refuge doesn't erase public consequences. The room felt tighter now, smaller. What Schiff had relied on for years, authority, ambiguity, implication, was being stripped away line by line, and the silence that followed said more than any rebuttal could. Adam Schiff was no longer the prosecutor. He was the defendant, and he had just pleaded the fifth in the court of public opinion. Schiff took a sip of water. His hand shook, just a tremor, barely visible, but the water in the glass rippled. He needed to change the subject. Russia was a losing battlefield. He needed to move to ground where he felt morally superior. Disinformation, that was his home turf. He was the champion of fighting fake news. He leaned toward the microphone, his voice regaining some of its old, sanctimonious texture. Director Gabbard, Schiff said, signaling a pivot. Let's address the disinformation landscape during elections. The threats we face are not just external. They are systemic. It was a safe talking point. A softball. Gabbard didn't hesitate. She didn't look at her notes. She looked at him with the terrifying focus of a sniper who has just seen the target step out from behind cover. Let's talk about the laptop, she said. The words hit the room like a physical blow. A ripple moved through the crowd. The aides behind Schiff froze. The laptop, the third rail, the story that had been buried, banned, and throttled by the very machinery Schiff helped build. Schiff's expression tightened. The mask of the statesman slipped, revealing the operative beneath. You're referring to a story, Schiff said, his tone dismissive, bordering on disgusted, that bore clear hallmarks of Russian disinformation. Gabbard finished the sentence for him. That phrase. Schiff nodded. Yes. He walked right into it. Gabbard replied evenly. You promoted a letter signed by former intelligence officials making that claim. The letter of 51. Schiff raised his hand slightly, a gesture of authority. That letter expressed professional judgment. It expressed certainty, Gabbard said, without evidence. The timing was suspicious. Schiff countered quickly. He was reciting the script now. The script that CNN and MSNBC had run on a loop for weeks in October 2020. A mysterious laptop appearing weeks before an election? It had all the classic signs. The FBI had the laptop for months, Gabbard replied. Her voice cut through his panic. And authenticated it. Schiff frowned. That wasn't publicly known. You were briefed, she said. Schiff blinked. The air left his lungs. You were the chairman of the Intelligence Committee, she continued. You knew there was no intelligence assessment calling it Russian disinformation. You knew the FBI had the physical hardware. And yet, she let the silence stretch. And yet, you went on national television and told the American people it was a Kremlin operation. Schiff shook his head. The letter didn't claim certainty. It claimed hallmarks. And you amplified it as validation, Gabbard said. We had to warn the public. Schiff cried out. He sounded desperate now. The logic of saving democracy was crumbling under the weight of the lie used to save it. You warned them with authority you didn't have, she replied. An intelligence that didn't exist. Schiff's voice rose slightly. It was an opinion signed by 51 former intelligence officials. Patriots, men and women who served. Marketed as intelligence consensus, Gabbard said. You laundered a political talking point through the reputation of the intelligence community. Schiff paused. He looked around the room. He needed an ally. But the Democrats on the dais were studying their papers intensely. No one wanted to be in the splash zone of this explosion. Free speech allows, Schiff started. Not when you weaponize credibility, she interrupted. Schiff flinched. You knew media outlets would treat that letter as confirmation, she said. You knew big tech would use it as a pretext to censor the story. You knew exactly what you were doing. Schiff responded sharply. The press makes its own decisions. Twitter makes its own decisions. And you fed them the narrative, she said, at the most consequential moment of an election. Schiff looked down. He saw the headline in his mind. Schiff confirms laptop was real. He saw the collapse of the moral high ground he had stood on for 4 years. The intent was to protect democracy, Schiff muttered. It was the credo of the deep state. We had to destroy the truth to save the village. The effect was to suppress a true story, Gabbard replied cold and hard. And you never corrected it. Schiff exhaled it. The information environment was volatile. So, it was the misuse of intelligence branding, she said. And you blurred the line deliberately. Schiff shook his head. That's an accusation. It's a pattern, Gabbard replied. Imply. Amplify. Retreat. She leaned forward. Was there any intelligence assessment labeling the laptop Russian disinformation? Schiff hesitated. The camera zoomed in. This was the moment. Not formally, Schiff admitted. Gabbard nodded. Yet you let the public believe there was. Schiff said nothing. You knew the weight your words carried, she continued. And you used that weight politically. Schiff looked up. His eyes were hard now. Cornered animals don't cry. They bite. This is selective framing, he spat. You are ignoring the threat of foreign interference to focus on a laptop. This is documented sequence, Gabbard said. And sequence matters. The silence returned. Another claim, another implication, another absence of proof. And another moment where the classified refuge failed to materialize. Schiff broke the silence. You're stitching unrelated events together to create a conspiracy. Gabbard replied without hesitation. I'm following the same thread. Schiff crossed his arms. Selective leaks are a media issue, not an intelligence failure. They're an oversight issue, Gabbard said, especially when they come after closed-door hearings. Schiff frowned. You're implying I leaked classified material. I'm describing timing, she replied. Testimony behind closed doors. Headlines hours later. Always damaging to your opponents. Always anonymous. Always you. Schiff shook his head. That's circumstantial. So, was much of what you implied about me, Gabbard said. Yet you treated it as meaningful. Schiff leaned forward. Are you accusing me directly? I'm asking you to explain the pattern, she replied. Who benefited from those leaks? Schiff responded quickly. The public. Gabbard nodded slightly. A dark, cynical acknowledgement. The narrative did. Schiff raised his voice. Transparency matters. Selective transparency distorts, she said. And you never condemned it. Schiff paused. Because I didn't control it. You benefited from it, Gabbard replied. And you never corrected it. Schiff exhaled sharply. This is speculative. Then let's talk about Ukraine, she said. The room shifted again. The topic whiplash was disorienting Schiff. He couldn't set his feet. Every time he tried to defend one lie, she moved to the next one. Schiff stiffened. That's a different matter. Is it? Gabbard asked. You claim no prior contact with the whistleblower. Schiff responded firmly. I said I didn't know their identity. You denied coordination, she replied, until the record said otherwise. Schiff leaned back. My staff followed proper procedures. After initially denying contact, Gabbard said, and correcting only when exposed. Schiff shook his head. You're mischaracterizing. I'm quoting timelines, she replied. First denial, then clarification. Always in that order. Schiff's jaw tightened. That distinction mattered. It mattered because credibility matters, Gabbard said, and it eroded again. Schiff glanced at the clock. Make it stop. Just make it stop. This is turning into a political argument, he said. It's turning into an accountability one, she replied. She continued calmly. Each time there's a denial, then a revision, then a justification, and finally silence. Schiff replied quietly. You're framing oversight as manipulation. I'm framing inconsistency as risk, Gabbard said, especially when intelligence is involved. Schiff folded his hands. You're suggesting bad faith. I'm suggesting the public noticed, she replied, and they stopped trusting explanations that came after exposure. Schiff didn't respond. For a moment, the room felt suspended, not because of what was said, but because of what no longer worked. The familiar defenses, national security, protecting sources, Russian disinformation, were thinning. They were transparent now. Schiff looked small. The giant chair of the committee chairman seemed to swallow him. He wasn't the master of the universe anymore. He was just a man in a suit who had been caught red-handed, holding a smoking gun he claimed was a water pistol. And Gabbard? She wasn't gloating. She was just turning the page to the next count in the indictment. Now, Schiff said, trying to soundboard, trying to dismiss her. You're expanding this beyond the scope of this hearing. Steady, Gabbard replied. I'm following the consequences. She looked at him. We need to talk about January 6th. Schiff's eyes widened. This was his temple, his holy ground. He thought he was safe there. He thought he was the hero of that story. He was about to find out he was the villain of that one, too. Schiff adjusted his microphone. The movement was crisp, aggressive. He felt a surge of energy return to his limbs. They were finally talking about January 6th. This was his turf. This was his legacy. He had produced that investigation like a Hollywood blockbuster, hiring TV executives to manage the primetime hearings, editing testimony for maximum emotional impact, curating the narrative of an insurrection. He was the Spielberg of the deep state, and he was proud of it. Now, Schiff said, his voice deepening into its history judge register. You're expanding this beyond the scope of this hearing. Steady, Gabbard replied, her voice cooling the air. I'm following the consequences. Schiff leaned back, a faint, arrogant smile playing on his lips. The January 6th committee was about accountability. It was about preserving the Republic. Gabbard nodded once. Then let's talk about records. Schiff's smile vanished. Let's talk about what you kept, she said, and what you threw away. Schiff's eyes narrowed. All records were handled appropriately. Some were destroyed, Gabbard said. The sentence was short, simple, and catastrophic. Schiff blinked. After the investigation concluded, not when future review is foreseeable, she cut in. Not when dissent exists. Schiff leaned forward, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the edge of the dais. We followed standard procedure. Standard procedure is preservation, she replied. Destruction is what happens when you don't want the future to check your work. Schiff raised his voice slightly. The committee released extensive findings. We released thousands of pages. Selectively, Gabbard said. She opened the folder again. Schiff hated that folder. It was like a book of spells, and every time she opened it, he shrank. Testimony excerpts, she read. Edited transcripts. No full context. You released the cut that made your movie work. You burned the outtakes. Schiff shook his head vigorously. We protected sensitive information. We protected witnesses. You curated a narrative, she replied, and removed material that challenged it. The room was deadly silent. The accusation was no longer about bad judgment or political bias. It was about spoliation of evidence. In a legal court, that implies guilt. In the court of public opinion, it implies a cover-up. Schiff stiffened. That's a serious claim. So was calling it the definitive account, Gabbard said, while destroying underlying evidence. Schiff paused. He looked at the cameras. He needed to explain this away. He needed to make the destruction of files sound like a bureaucratic necessity, like taking out the trash. There was no requirement to preserve everything indefinitely, Schiff said, his voice tight. There is when history isn't settled, she said, and when criminal referrals were made. Schiff leaned back. You're undermining democratic institutions. I'm defending them, Gabbard replied instantly, by asking why evidence was preserved for the prosecution but destroyed for the defense. Schiff responded sharply. The findings speak for themselves. Only because alternatives were erased, she said. A brief silence followed. It was the silence of a library where someone has just ripped pages out of a history book. Schiff spoke again. The public demanded answers. They demanded truth, Gabbard replied. And truth requires transparency, not finality. Schiff tapped the desk. Tap, tap, tap. The rhythm of a nervous breakdown. You're suggesting bias. I'm describing process, she said. Closed selection. Public certainty. No appeal. Schiff frowned. Dissent was heard. It wasn't released, she replied. And then it was destroyed. Schiff looked toward the chair. This is turning speculative. It's documented, Gabbard said. She looked him in the eye. Votes taken. Records logged. Files removed. Schiff's voice dropped. The work was done. The questions weren't, she replied. She leaned forward slightly. When evidence disappears, trust follows it. Schiff didn't answer. He couldn't. He knew she was right. He knew that somewhere, in a shredder or a digital trash bin, lay the testimony that contradicted his grand narrative. The testimony that showed security failures he ignored. The testimony that showed the complexity he simplified. He had built a monument to himself, but he had used a wrecking ball on the foundation to do it. For years, Gabbard continued, her voice low and resonant. You positioned yourself as the guardian of democracy. Schiff met her gaze. He tried to summon the old fire. And I stand by that. Then explain why the public can never re-examine the record, she said. Explain why accountability ended when your conclusions were reached. Schiff hesitated, just long enough. This committee was never about debate, he said finally. It was about responsibility. And responsibility includes preservation, Gabbard replied, especially when power is involved. The room felt different now. Not tense, exposed. What had once been framed as protection of the Republic was now being questioned as control of a narrative. The silence that followed wasn't defensive. It was uncertain. The aides behind Schiff were no longer texting. They were staring at the floor, wondering if they could be subpoenaed. Schiff spoke first, slower now. He was tired. The adrenaline was fading, replaced by the heavy lead of reality. You're painting me as a villain, he said. I'm describing outcomes, Gabbard answered calmly. Schiff shook his head. My career has been about protecting institutions. Gabbard nodded. And mine has been about serving under them. It was a subtle distinction, but a brutal one. You protect the building. I serve the people inside it. Schiff leaned forward. You're suggesting the system itself is corrupted. I'm suggesting it's fragile, she replied. And that words from powerful people carry weight it can't always absorb. Schiff exhaled. Trust and intelligence is essential. So it was restraint, Gabbard said, especially when evidence is incomplete. Schiff raised a finger. We can't wait for perfect certainty. No, she agreed. But we can avoid declaring certainty where it doesn't exist. Schiff paused. He looked at her, really looked at her. She wasn't playing the game. She wasn't looking for a soundbite. She was looking for confession. You think I crossed that line, he said. I think you erased it, she replied. Over and over. Schiff's voice softened slightly. You've never sat where I sat today. I've sat in briefing rooms, Gabbard said. I've watched analysts debate probabilities, not conclusions. Schiff nodded. And sometimes action is required. Action isn't assertion, she said. And implication isn't proof. Schiff looked down at his notes. They were meaningless now. The hearing was off the rails. The script was burned. You believe I misled the public, he said. It wasn't a question. I believe you trained them to trust implication, she replied, and to accept correction quietly when it failed. Schiff looked up. That's an unfair characterization. It's a measurable one, Gabbard said. Headlines first. Walkbacks later. Schiff crossed his arms. You're ignoring intent. I'm focusing on effect, she replied. Because effect is what people live with. Schiff was quiet for a moment. He saw the polling numbers in his head. He saw the trust in media plummeting. He saw the divided country. He had always blamed Trump. He had always blamed the Russians. But sitting here under the cold lights, faced with the cold logic of Tulsi Gabbard, a terrifying thought entered his mind. What if I helped break it? You're asking for an impossible standard, he whispered. I'm asking for the one intelligence already has, she said. Probabilities stated as probabilities. Schiff nodded slowly. And when the public demands certainty? Then leadership demands honesty, Gabbard replied, even when it's unsatisfying. Schiff sighed. A long, rattling sound. You think this erosion of trust is my fault? I think you accelerated it, she said, by substituting confidence for confirmation. Schiff leaned back. And you think today fixes that? No, Gabbard replied, but it starts naming it. The room stayed silent. This wasn't personal anymore. It was structural. It was an autopsy of the Washington consensus. This isn't personal, she added. It's necessary. Schiff finally spoke. You want me to apologize. I want you to acknowledge limits, she said. Publicly. Clearly. Schiff looked away. He looked at the exit sign. The red letters glowed like a warning. Washington doesn't reward that, he said. Gabbard met his gaze. Neither does history. The balance had shifted again, not toward anger, but toward something more dangerous. Clarity. The fog was gone. And without the fog, Adam Schiff was just a man who had sold a lie he couldn't afford to buy back. The chair cleared his throat signaling time. But it was too late. The record was set. The files might have been destroyed, but the memory of their absence was now permanent. Schiff leaned toward the microphone one last time. He looked exhausted. The deep lines around his mouth, usually hidden by studio lighting, were starkly visible under the harsh glare of the committee room. "Director Gabbard," he said, his voice raspy. "This hearing was meant to evaluate your judgment. It was a final, desperate attempt to reframe reality." A Hail Mary passed to the reporters in the back row. Gabbard looked at him steadily. She didn't blink. She didn't flinch. "And it has," she replied. Schiff's eyes flickered. He knew what she meant. The mirror had been turned. "You've challenged my record repeatedly today," Schiff said, trying to summon the ghost of his old authority. "You've made accusations." "I've referenced the record," Gabbard replied. "There's a difference." Schiff nodded slowly, a mechanical movement. "You believe I abused my position. I believe you used it without sufficient restraint," she said, "and without correction when it mattered." Schiff exhaled a long, shuddering breath. "You're asking me to rewrite years of work. I'm asking you to reconcile it," Gabbard said, "with what the record now shows." Schiff glanced briefly at the cameras. The red tally lights were still on. They were recording every twitch, every bead of sweat. "Public service is imperfect," Schiff muttered. "So is silence," she replied. A pause followed. It was heavy, suffocating. The air in the room felt physical, like water filling a sinking ship. Schiff spoke again. "You want a confession?" "I want accountability," she replied. "They're not the same." Schiff shot back, a flash of anger breaking through. "In this town," Gabbard said, "accountability is a confession, because it means admitting you were wrong." Schiff leaned back. The leather chair creaked, a sound of protest. "The country is more divided than ever because trust was treated as expendable, and certainty was sold where doubt existed," Gabbard finished for him. Schiff's voice dropped to a whisper. Only the sensitive directional mics picked it up. "You think I should apologize?" Gabbard didn't hesitate. "I think the public deserved 1 year ago." Schiff looked down at his hands. "For what?" "For saying you had evidence you didn't," she said, counting the counts on her fingers. "For implying disloyalty without proof. For using intelligence authority to shape political outcomes." Schiff was silent. "You asked Americans to trust you," Gabbard continued. "They did." She leaned forward slightly. "The final indictment. And when the truth emerged, that trust wasn't repaired. It was discarded." Schiff finally looked up. His eyes were glassy. "I acted in the country's interest." "Intent doesn't negate impact," she replied. "And impact is what people remember." Another pause. "Say plainly what you didn't have," she urged him. "Acknowledge what you implied. And accept what that did to public trust." The room was still. Everyone waited. The press, the aides, the other senators. They waited for Adam Schiff, the great orator of the Democratic Party, to speak. He opened his mouth. He looked at the microphone. He looked at Gabbard. And then he closed it. He reached out and turned off his microphone. Click. The sound was deafening. The chair moved to close the session. "This hearing is adjourned." As microphones clicked off and aides shifted in their seats, one thing was clear. The most important question of the day hadn't been answered, and everyone in the room knew why. The room emptied quickly. It was a scramble. Staffers whispered as they packed up binders, their eyes darting toward Schiff, who was still sitting at the dais, staring at a blank page. "That didn't go how it was supposed to," one aide muttered. "No," another replied, shoving a laptop into a bag. "He wasn't ready for that." "Ready or not," the first one said, "it's out there now." Schiff stood up. He buttoned his jacket. He smoothed his tie. He tried to put the mask back on, but it didn't fit anymore. It was cracked. He moved toward the side exit, avoiding the main press line. This was unusual. Adam Schiff lived for the press line. He usually held court there for 20 minutes after every hearing. Today, he was a ghost. Gabbard gathered her papers slowly. She stood up, her movements deliberate, unhurried. She walked toward the center aisle. A reporter called out, "Director, do you feel vindicated?" She didn't stop walking. She didn't smile. "This wasn't about me," she said, her voice catching the tail end of a boom mic. Another voice followed, shouting over the heads of security. "Senator Schiff, Any response to the allegations? Did you have the evidence? Yes or no? Schiff paused, just for a split second. He looked at the reporter. For a moment, the old instinct flared, the desire to spin, to explain, to weave a narrative. But then he remembered the folder on Gabbard's table. He remembered the oath. This hearing speaks for itself, he muttered. And then he turned his back. He walked fast. Too fast. It wasn't a walk. It was a retreat. He pushed through the double doors, his aides forming a phalanx around him to block the cameras. The heavy wooden doors swung shut with a final, resonant thud. Schiff was gone. Schiff sat alone in his office. The blinds were drawn. On the wall, the TV was muted. CNN was playing the clip. Not his opening statement. Not his lecture on democracy. They were playing the silence. The banner at the bottom of the screen read, "Gabbard presses Schiff on direct evidence." He watched himself on the screen. He saw the hesitation. He saw the fear. He looked like a man who had forgotten his lines in the middle of a play. An aide knocked on the door. "Sir." Schiff didn't turn around. "What? Do you want to issue a statement?" the aide asked nervously. "We have a draft ready. It focuses on Russian interference and the need for vigilance." Schiff laughed. It was a dry, humorless sound. "No," he said. "Sir." "It won't work," Schiff whispered. "Not today." "What about clarification?" the aide pressed. "We can say you were referring to the totality of the circumstances." "We'll see," Schiff said. He waved his hand. "Leave me." The aide retreated. Schiff looked at his phone. It was buzzing. Twitter, Truth Social, YouTube. The clips were spreading like wildfire. Millions of views in minutes. The comments were brutal. He finally got caught. Look at his face. The silence says everything. He turned the phone over. Across town, Gabbard was walking into the sunlight. She didn't stop for interviews. She got into a waiting car. Her staff was buzzing with excitement, checking the polls, checking the engagement numbers. "They'll try to reframe it," one staffer said. "They always do." Gabbard looked out the window at the Capitol dome. "That's fine," she said. "You think it changes anything?" Gabbard nodded. "It already has." That evening, the commentators tried to save him. They debated tone instead of substance. She was confrontational, MSNBC said. He was measured, CNN claimed. She crossed a line of decorum, the New York Times wrote. But beneath the noise of the machine, something had shifted. The tectonic plates of Washington had moved. People replayed the same exchange. "Say it clearly. Under oath. Do you have the evidence?" And they noticed what didn't follow. Schiff's silence became a character in the story. It was louder than his speeches. It was heavier than his gavels. Days later, the hearing was still circulating. Not as breaking news, but as a reference point. A historical marker. A clip replayed during a panel discussion. Another surfaced during a late-night monologue. Another during a podcast about institutional trust. Each time, the same silence followed the same question. People began asking it elsewhere. In interviews with other politicians. In editorials. In rooms that had relied on implication for far too long. Do you have the evidence? Or did you just have a narrative? The answer never came from Schiff. He retreated into the background, his influence diminished, his shield of invincibility shattered. He was still a congressman, still a chairman, but he was no longer the high priest of truth. He was just a politician who had been blinked. And in Washington, that was the part no one could control. Because the moment someone asked for proof, plainly and publicly, the rules changed. The era of trust me was over. The era of show me had begun. And that memory, the memory of Adam Schiff staring into the abyss of his own empty claims, wasn't going away. It was the sanction of silence. And it was deafening.